Hello English College. I'm Jakub Renner. I was a student at the English College from 1997 to 2003, and I'm saying hello to you today from the European Parliament buildings in Brussels, Belgium, where I work. First of all, before I delve into the subject of this video, I'd like to thank everyone who made it possible for me to record the video in the first place. Now, this video is a part of the My Journey initiative of the English College, which I find a wonderful thing to do. My video will be all about my work. I work as an interpreter for the European Parliament, so this video, inevitably, will be about languages. Now, when I was asked to do this video, I started thinking, well, maybe I could do the video in German. But then I thought, well, how many people could actually understand that at the English College? And then I thought, maybe I could even actually do this video in Italian, which was really just a passing thought. Then I thought about doing the video in Czech, which arguably would have given it a much larger audience at the English College, but still, perhaps there would have been some people who wouldn't be able to understand. So here I am with a video in English then. Now, I'm supposed to talk about my career and make a video that would help students make the proper career choice after they graduate from the English College. So I'd like to structure this video into 3 parts, really. First, I will give you an overview of the subjects that I took at the English College. Then I will talk to you about my studies after the English College. And finally, I would like to tell you a bit about my career of an interpreter at the European Parliament. Now, speaking about my studies at the English College, I was, of course, part of the IB program, the International Baccalaureate, which I'm sure all of you watching this video now are doing. My subjects were Czech, English, advanced mathematics, advanced physics, advanced chemistry, and philosophy. Those were my main IB subjects. And I also had a 7th subject, that was German. So you see, I did try to keep my options as open as possible during my studies, because frankly I didn't really have any idea what I would like to be doing after I graduated, So if perhaps any of you are in that same situation that your IB exams are getting closer and you don't really know what you'd like to be doing after, you haven't really made your choices yet, I'd like to impress upon you not to worry, because that's the way it is with the vast majority of us. At the same time, I'd like to urge you to use all of the possibilities that the English College has to offer, and there are many of those as well. I remember from my studies, I'd just like to point out 2 things that I did during my time at the English College. There was the opportunity to attend the LIYSF, the London Youth International Science Forum, which I had the tremendous opportunity to attend on behalf of the English College. And I'd also like to mention the IISPSC. I'm sorry, it's a bit of an alphabet soup right there. But that was the International Independent Schools Public Speaking Championship. And that took place in Toronto, actually. Oh, I forgot to mention the LIYSF, of course, took place in London, since it has London in its name. So that's as far as my ECP studies is concerned. Now, as the IB exams came close, of course, my career choices post-ECP became a bit clearer. They weren't crystal clear, but they were clearer. I had several schools in my crosshairs, as it were, then, but in the end, I decided to go for interpretation translation training at the Faculty of Arts of the Charles University in Prague. Now, this may surprise you, why after studying the English College you would go for a university in the Czech Republic, and there is a good reason for that, and I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, there I decided to study English and German. And first, of course, there was the 3-year undergraduate program. Of course, it wasn't called the undergraduate program because this was all before Bologna. So it was just the study program, but it was even then split into two parts. The first 3 years and then the last 2 years. The first 3 years being more theoretical in terms of interpretation theory, and the last 2 years being more practical in terms of actually learning to be an interpreter. Now, here we really come to the point of me talking about interpreting and what that is all about, but if you allow me, I'd like to get to that in a short while. I'd just like to venture on a point of choice between schools, really, because interpretation is a bit specific where that is concerned. You see, the Czech interpretation course at the Charles University that I took is a university course, which means that you do university things there. You focus on research, you focus on theory, you focus on understanding the cognitive science that is embedded into interpretation in terms of it being a process. And it's not really much of a practical course. In other countries, in Belgium, in England, in France, interpreting schools are much more practice-oriented. In other words, there you learn the techniques of interpreting. How do you interpret this? How do you interpret that? And you don't really focus so much on the linguistic theory. So that might be a choice for you if you're considering interpretation as your possible career, is to think about, do I really want to focus on interpretation from the scientific point of view? Or do I really want to be very practical oriented and just do the interpreting, never mind the theory so much? I mean, of course, you will have to do a bit of theory to get there in the end, but you don't have to do as much as we did at the Charles University. So, then I graduated. This was in 2009, and I worked as an interpreter on the private market in the Czech Republic. Then, in 2010, I applied and was accredited to be a freelance interpreter for the European institutions. What does that mean? Well, if you want to work as an interpreter for the European institutions, you can't just come off the street and say, hello, here I am, I'm an interpreter, let me work. It doesn't work that way. You have to go through a test which basically says, yes, this person is qualified to work for us, or no, this person is not qualified to work for us. And then you need to go back and do more practice. So anyway, I was accredited in 2010. And then in late 2010, I was offered a job opportunity. There was an empty post in the Czech booth at the European Parliament. And I decided to accept that job. And I started working at the European Parliament in 2011. Now, I did mention that this was a temporary post. Maybe I didn't mention it, but I should have mentioned it. But it was a temporary post anyway. And therefore, I had to find some way of making it permanent. And that I did by passing an interinstitutional competition, which is, to put it simply, a selection procedure for European civil servants, which lasted from 2015 to 2017. Now, that might strike you as a very long time period, and it was. And of course, you needed to be a good interpreter, and you needed to have all the other skills that were required, and you needed to study hard, etc., etc. But the most important personality trait at this stage was patience. But anyway, after the 2 years of the competition, I switched from a temporary post to a permanent post, and that's where I've been working. Specifically, I work, as I've already mentioned, in the Czech booth at the European Parliament. Now, this competition was a competition specifically tailored for interpreters. It was pretty much not unlike the accreditation test that I had taken some years before. They tested, in addition to the other skills that are being tested for every single European civil servant out there, they also tested us in our interpretation ability. And that then determined, I mean, of course, this was an interpreter's job, so the interpretation part of the competition was not unimportant, but that also determined whether or not we would get the job in the end. But at the same time, you couldn't get the job without also passing all of the other bits that are, you might say, not really as interpretation related. Now, this was just one competition. If you'd like to explore a career in the European institutions, I also need to tell you that there are all kinds of other competitions ongoing almost all the time. The European Union is almost always looking for new people to join its civil service ranks, as it were, and you can work as inspectors, as engineers, as doctors, as scientists. Sky's the limit, really. Now, I'd like to come back to what I said before and talk a bit about interpreting as such. Now, this is where it gets fun, but it also gets a bit more technical. Interpretation in itself is quite easy enough to understand, I would say, but understanding the cognitive processes that are underlying interpretation can be a bit more tricky, you know. Let's do a very brief exercise. I want everyone listening to stop for a moment, focus, and without rewinding the video, without practicing going back and forth, I want you to say what comes to your mind, in your own native language, by the way, when I say chair. Have you had enough time to say it? Okay. The process of that happening is, and this is where the science begins, is that you heard me say chair. Now, that triggered understanding in your mind, and I bet that almost immediately you started seeing pictures in your mind. Right? You decoded, in other words, the word chair. You recognized it as an English word. You decoded it, associated it with an object, something to sit on, often made of wood, maybe with some padding, armrests or no. So that's the concept. And then you change that concept over into your own native language. Then you found the word in your native language for the concept, and then you said the word. And that's essentially what interpretation is. It's a constant process of decoding something from the source language, transcoding it, in other words, changing the concept between the source language and the target language, and then in the end, encoding it into the different word in the target language. Now, of course, we use the word chair, but you can use anything for this simple exercise. And then all of a sudden you start seeing different connotations. Maybe there's a different word for chair in a language when it's a chair for sitting on at the dinner table, and a different word for when it's a chair for sitting on at the office. And this is really very fascinating about interpretation. We could go on for hours and hours talking about fascinating concepts from interpretation theory, but I think I will spare you that for the moment, frankly. One thing that I do need to mention at this point, though, to get it out of the way, is if you want to study interpretation, if you apply to go to an interpretation school, you are not signing up for a language school. Okay? Interpretation schools are not there to teach their students the languages. You already have to have very profound knowledge of both the languages, really, because remember, we're talking about one language that you're interpreting from and another language that you're interpreting into. And very often, students think that, oh, well, okay, we only really need to know the language that we're interpreting from, and they completely forget that they also have to interpret into a different language. But that's just as important. Both need to be at a very high level. One thing that I would also like to mention very briefly, because it's relevant in terms of the career choices that you might be making in interpretation, is a very concise history of interpreting. Interpreters very often claim that they are either the oldest or perhaps the second oldest profession in the world, in the history of man. Be that as it may, interpretation, up to maybe 70 years ago or so, would mostly be consecutive. What does that mean? Well, it means that there would be a speaker, they would speak, and next to them there would be an interpreter. The interpreter would wait for the speaker to finish speaking, and then they would give their interpretation of the speech, right? So in terms of time, you would need time for the original speech, and then time for the interpretation. At the end of the Second World War, however, when the Nuremberg trial came about, they introduced a brand new form of interpretation that's called simultaneous interpretation, because there they didn't really have the time to hear the original and hear the interpretation after that. They needed to speed things up a bit. So they developed a method where the speaker would be speaking, and at the same time the interpreter would be listening and interpreting on the fly in real time, call it whatever you want, at the same time as the speaker was speaking, right? So all of a sudden, you wouldn't have this speech interpretation time requirement. You would have the speech and interpretation almost at the same time, almost overlapping. There would be a difference of a couple of seconds between the two. So that's simultaneous interpretation, which has been used since mid-1940s, let's say. But right now, under the current circumstances, there is another profound change coming about. And it's been brought about by the fact that people can't travel as much as they used to, or as they used to like to anymore. We're calling this remote simultaneous interpretation, which is pretty much the same as simultaneous interpretation, except for the fact that not everybody needs to be in the same place at the same time. Of course, you will imagine that at the Nuremberg trial, everyone was in one large courtroom. But that's not true anymore. You can have a speaker in a conference room. You can have the audience on the other side of the world. And you can have interpreters either with the speaker in the conference room or maybe on the other side of the world, not even where the audience is. And everybody's connected through the internet, through various platforms that enable the interpreters to listen to the speaker in the original language. They can speak their interpretation, and the platforms also enable the audiences to listen to the interpreters in the various languages that there are at that particular venue. And mind you, we're not just talking about one or two languages. We can be talking about as many as, let's say, 20 languages at a time, which of course makes things much more complicated. Interpretation in general. If I were to speak about that, what would I say? Well, I think that the most important aspect to interpretation for me is it's a constant learning process, really. You're never really done learning to be a good interpreter, and that makes it fun for me, just plain simple. You do need a tremendous amount of general knowledge. You can't just learn the two languages and leave it at that. You also need to know what the people are actually talking about, right? For example, if I were to ask you who the current president of the United States was, you'd probably know that, right? But if I asked you about the previous one, and the previous one before that, and maybe the previous one before that, some people might have a bit of a problem with that, right? But that's the sort of thing that you also need to know. If a speaker all of a sudden decides to talk about their experience with a particular event in the past, then the interpreter ideally should be able to understand what the speaker is talking about, because it of course influences what the speaker says and how they say it. And at the European Parliament, things are just as varied. You can work on economy in the morning, the environment in the afternoon, and perhaps industry or fisheries the next day. You can also learn new languages. I mean, with interpretation, you would expect that interpreters would know as many languages as possible, really. It's not important to know 20 languages. It's important to know your languages well. But the European Parliament does offer very conveniently the possibility of for interpreters to learn new languages as their career progresses. Speaking of the European Parliament, there is a quite peculiar way that the European Parliament works as opposed to how interpretation usually works on the private market. On the private market, i.e. when a company hires an interpreter to work for them in a meeting, you usually work in a bilingual regime. Biactive is also called sometimes, meaning that you interpret both into your, shall we say, native language and into one of your foreign languages, okay? Meaning, to be completely blunt, there's a participant from England, let's say, and there's a participant from the Czech Republic. They would just have the one interpreter, okay? So when the Czech delegate speaks, the interpreter interprets into English. When the English delegate speaks, the interpreter interprets into Czech. Biactive. Both are active. Whereas at the European Parliament, we work into our native languages most of the time. Meaning, me working in the Czech booth, we work into Czech. We speak Czech. The delegates may speak whichever of the official languages of the EU, but we speak Czech. And it's the same for the German booth, the English booth, the Italian booth, etc., etc., etc. Now, exceptionally, because Czech isn't a language known to everyone, it can also happen that from time to time, and this unfortunately doesn't happen quite as often as I would like, we can also speak in a foreign language, in my case English, which you might have guessed, which is then used by all the other interpreters to work again into their own native languages. So, to complete the thought, as it were, it can happen at a particular point in time that there are perhaps several thousand people listening to my English interpretation, which is something to think about, really. Which brings me to another very important aspect of being an interpreter. You mustn't be afraid to speak in front of other people. Whether it's in consecutive mode, and you're speaking to a small audience at a cocktails party or something like that, or whether it's in simultaneous mode when you're not really speaking to an audience directly, but you are speaking into a microphone, and of course from there, all of the audience can listen to you. And perhaps even your interpretation, just as at the European Parliament, is then transmitted over the internet for everybody to hear if they so choose. By the way, if you're interested in that, you can listen to interpretation on the European Parliament's website. Now, there is one last thing, and I promise I'm coming to the end here. There is one last thing that I would like to mention, and that's the difference between working on the private market and perhaps being accredited to work in the European institutions versus working for the European institutions as a European civil servant. And this really depends on the kind of person that you are and what you specifically prefer. Most interpreters, in absolute numbers, in the world, in other words, would be self-employed. They would have small businesses and they would be working based on contracts for whoever. Big international companies, even domestic companies sometimes, international institutions. They would travel all over the world and they would sort of have to depend on their clients approaching them to give them the opportunity to interpret. On the other hand, a European civil servant is only allowed to work for the European institutions, obviously, where they don't really have to worry about approaching clients so much, because that's all handled by the European institutions, but then they do not have as much diversity in their work, as it were, compared to someone who really travels the whole world, and there are interpreters like that. So again, that is a choice that you need to make based on what kind of a person you are, what your personal preferences would be. Now, I think I've come to the end here, really. So to conclude, let me just say, I hope that you've enjoyed yourselves as much as I have, and I would like to thank again to everybody who made this video recording possible. Of course, if there are any questions, you are welcome to get in touch with me at my email address, which is Jakub, Jakub, Renner, Renner, at ep.europa.eu. I wish you all the best in your career choices and in your future careers indeed. And who knows, Maybe we'll even have an opportunity to meet in person, either at the ECP or at one of its events someday. Thank you very much.